Well, I've brought objects because I'm like, how do you
Mm.
talk about a book and keep people like, following the big things about the book without me showing slides? So I've got objects, I've got four objects. So one is water, and the big takeaway is about water. So I'll talk about that. The second is about fractals, and I've got my fern, which I've cut from my garden, and I want to talk about that. And then the third is drawing inspiration from nature. This is meant to be a goose. Canada geese, okay? But this was the best I could find in my daughter's bedroom. That's a goose. And then the final and fourth one is mushroom, right? And like mushroom and mycelium networks. And so I've got four objects, and I think we can navigate the conversation through four objects. Ultimately, emergent strategy is a strategy for building complex patterns and systems of change through relatively small interactions. It is a practice that is adaptive and relational in your way of being. I start with water because I think the first principle of emergent strategy is to accept that change is constant. Rather than to steel yourself against change, it explores our human relationships to change and it says, be like water, because water is constantly fluid, it is adaptable, it moves around and past fixed objects to reach its goal. And, I've got it in a cup, so a glass, and it's morphed to fit into the shape of the glass. But of course, if I had carried it in with a much bigger vase, it would have taken on a different shape. In the same way with floods, right? Water just flows, but it can be a powerful force, right? And, at mass scale, it can produce great results or great outcomes or damaging outcomes. From a work perspective, it is also really useful when I think about facilitation work. I've had a massive learning from shifting from strategic planning to a place of strategic intention, which is something Adrienne Marie Brown talks a lot about, that the clearer you are as a group about where you're going, the more you can relax into collaborative innovation around how to get there. And I've seen myself in earlier days of facilitation work over prepare, over plan the agenda, ram the day with so much content and information because I believed that it would give them quality because I was, imparting a lot of, clever information. But actually, I have found that the most impactful days are when there's just less preparation and more presence. And it involves both trusting yourself, but also trusting in the group, right? Trusting that your participants have everything they need to contribute to the topic as long as everyone is clear about where they want to go. When I felt myself feeling the nerves before we hit record on this uh, session, I had to talk myself out of feeling like I need to read a script or I need to like, I don't know, be able to like bookmark this book to my favorite bits. And, that there is that kind of last minute scramble. And you have to tell yourself, no, you've just reread the book. You're living a lot of these principles. Now let go, right? You've got your objects, which was prep. I had to cut this fern, right? But you kind of need to then trust. I suppose there is some level of knowing yourself and trusting yourself to know that you need to let go. And I also am putting trust in this group that everyone's going to come with their questions and their contributions and hope for the best, right? And you guys already are. So I think it's partly knowing yourself and partly mutual faith in the world. And it comes up in the book where she says, I can't remember the exact quote, but something like, um, if you trust people, they become trustworthy. And it's a very optimistic view of the world, but I'd rather go by that view than to distrust and then people become distrustworthy. The fern is because she talks about fractals, a lot. And fractals, by their nature, is a never-ending pattern that is self-similar across different scales. So the same spiral on a seashell, for example, can be found in the shape of galaxies. And in the same way with a fern, if you zero in on one little branch, it is the same as the whole. Her belief is that if we want to create systemic change, if we want to have big impact, and all of us, long for the kind of big things in this life, whether it's love or whether it's success or whether it's scale for your business. But her perspective is you have to start small because what we practice at the small scale sets the pattern for the whole system. And therefore, I love the simplicity of thinking who we are and how we are at the small scale is how we are at the large scale. I have really taken this guidance to heart because in asking those big questions 3.5 years ago, how do I design a life where I'm in control of my time? How do I build a business that is contributive and meaningful? You're thinking about like big impact, right? Because that's the dream. But you realize that the only way to get there is to start small, right? And, she says this line, see our own lives and work and relationships as a front line, a first place we can practice justice, liberation, and alignment with each other and the planet. But your life is your front line, which is why I love the quote she's given from her mentor, Grace Lee Boggs, that says, transform yourself to transform the world. And that's where it's really relevant for any kind of coaching work that we do, self-development work, personal growth. It has to start with you. And if you want to change any part of this abusive system we live in, you've got to start with yourself. You've got to look inside first. And I think it's been really useful, not just for internal introspection, but also in me navigating what has felt like insurmountable challenges. What can I do that is simply one step forward, starting small? And as an example, one of the things I had in my mind 3 years ago was I feel in corporate life because I was for so long the representative of a company with my title. I'd lost the ability to really use my voice from a deep place, and I couldn't be honest in a way that felt true for me. And therefore, in deciding how am I going to learn to use my voice again, I started to do things like have dinner conversations with strangers. I started a podcast, partly because it was just the most uncomfortable personal challenge to try and press record, like highly uncomfortable to press record with me speaking. Like this has come a long way. So, but you start small, right? You start with the tiny challenges and you speak to one person. Small as all is a very easy one to remember.
Yeah.
Yeah. This one's simple because she uses this as the analogy, referring to Canada geese, right? And how when they're migrating, they all take turns at the front of the V, and they take turns being the leader, the weight carrier, and turns being the follower and the rester. And when a goose is injured during migration, two geese will land with it and stay with it until it is healed or it dies. And then what happens is they catch up with their flock after. So flocking is fundamentally about decentralizing the effort for safety, and trusting leadership comes from any edge of the flock. And I like this idea because it's very much inherent throughout the book, this idea of interdependence and decentralization, with which in leadership is still very subversive as a thought and counterintuitive because it's this idea of distributed leadership. So I think that's a big takeout, which I think intellectually we all know to be true, but the reality is I see this all the time. Rock star leaders are put on pedestals, and then they become a place for us to project our longings and our critiques, right? And before long, we tear them down. So distributed leadership is very much about how we collaborate and collaborate towards ideation as opposed to, building this superhero um, persona, which unfortunately media and our capitalistic society will continue to do. And therefore, it is really fighting against the grain to embody this kind of goose mindset. And then the other element I'd say very quickly about that is practicing liberated relationships, which is a term that she uses, which is all about how to get more honest in relationships. Uh, I think the belief is that to be more interdependent in your mindset and to have a more distributed leadership mindset, you have to change the way you relate to people. And this is something I have learned through practice. How can I rely on people a little bit more and a bit better? How can I ask for help better? And what you find is when you ask for help and you share more of yourself, you are affirmed in people's generosity and their willingness and their trustworthiness. And then it becomes this flywheel again, right? But it's again a bit counterintuitive when you feel you need help. Many people just try and go at it alone, but it's about, being spongy and being open and being porous in the way that you have relationships. And I am learning how to do that better. And one of the things she talks about is ask for and receive what I need. And the result allows her to feel so much more woven into the world. And I love that saying. To feel woven into the world is to live an understanding of how the world is inherently interdependent. I'll just finish with the last one and then we can get into the chats, which is mushroom. And I think the mushroom is all about building resilience by building relationships. The ability, mushrooms basically detox soil around them, not just removing the toxins, but transforming toxic content into nourishment. And I think the whole idea is move towards life. This is my favorite principle in the whole thing, creating more possibility and embodying that belief in abundance is really important. And if we practice the spirit of abundance, we're always going to find ways to move towards life. If you constantly move towards life, if you constantly believe in abundance, then perhaps we could find resilient ways to be fluid like water. It's something you can practice. And if you believe in fractals, then with each daily experiment, and this is why I think it very much relates to many of you might have read Tiny Experiments by Anne-Laure, Cunff, but it's the same idea. Don't be attached to the outcome because the outcome is hard to fathom. Start small, start daily, and embody this mindset of experimentation and then see where it goes. Might be a fern.